Well, hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. We're here a day early. I have a cool opportunity for tomorrow, so I won't be around in the morning tomorrow. So I want to get Mike in the Midwest recorded and put out there a day early rather than a day late. And today I think it's an interesting, I've been wanting to do this show, but it's a little nerdy, but I hope you'll stick with me and see how we got from one point to another. I've been thinking about this one a lot, one of my passions. So stand by, we'll get started. Got to have my trusty Coke Zero ready to go. Nice and cold. Okay, here we go. Hope you're having a great Wednesday from a snowy St. Peters, Missouri. I know on the podcast today I complained that we never get snow. Hey, it got cold. It's snowing. Not much. We got about an inch, but it's better than nothing. All right, here we go. Welcome to episode number 32 of Mike in the Midwest, a mini podcast for our awesome patrons of the Be Our Guest podcast. Hey, we're here on your feed just a bit early, about 24 hours early, actually. I hope everybody is doing well. I'm recording the show a day early because tomorrow on Thursday, I have a great opportunity from one of our Be Our Guest podcast lizards, one of the great folks in the Be Our Guest podcast community. I will be actually speaking in a virtual conference to the Kansas 4-H group out there, the agricultural group, the farm group. I love this. I'm excited about this. They're going to do an all-week event, and I'm going to get to speak about podcasting. I'm going to do a couple seminars, one about podcasting 101, how to start a podcast, what a podcast is, how it can benefit your message, your advertising, your social media reach, how you can meet friends, how you can build relationships through a podcast. So I'm excited for that. And then actually the second little breakout session we're doing is all about the Be Our Guest podcast, which I'm super excited about that. I almost feel like I'm a student again because tonight I got to tweak the keynote presentation that I'm putting together on my Mac, and then convert that to a PowerPoint and convert that to Google Slides. So I have it all ready to go. And then tomorrow's almost going to be like teaching again. Not quite. And of course, I would still be in teaching if every lesson I could have done was on the Be Our Guest podcast or Podcasting 101. Awesome stuff. So I'm very honored to be asked to do that and super excited to join Jody and her colleagues out in Kansas. It's kind of ironic that a guy from Missouri is going to speak to a group from Kansas. If you know anything about our universities, Mizzou, Kansas, rivals, but we'll see what happens. It's all a big world, right? We're having a good time with that. So that's why we're here a bit early. Of course, we are recording this in case you're listening a long time from now on Wednesday, January 27th, 2021. Hope everybody's doing well. I know if you listen to today's Be Our Guest podcast episode, it's the listener questions. We had the human hashtag Scotty G joining us, and Pam was there as well. I mentioned at the top of the show that we just got cold rain in St. Louis, right? We got cold rain. We got about 2 inches the other day, just got raining, but it was like 35. No snow. I was so mad about that. Hey, right outside the podcast window right now, snow on the ground. It's very pretty outside. So I guess the big guy upstairs knew I needed a little snow, and I'm not going anywhere except maybe taking Superdog Riley out to go to the bathroom every once in a while, but that's about it. May go to Taco Bell tonight, but I'm sure the roads will be fine by then. So hope you're doing well. Excited to have you back. And of course, last week we did the show. I called it Stuff with Stories. I talked about stuff that is just sitting in the storage room that it's value. There's no value in it to anybody else, but to me, it's priceless. You know, I talked about my ball glove that I earned by making a bet with my dad about striking out X amount of players, batters in a season to get that glove. And then I earned it when I was about 12 and I used it all the way up into college. Thing is tore up, it's destroyed, but I would never give that glove away, even though it has no value to anybody else. Talked about my baseball card collection, the Be Our Guest podcast medal that we got made for the Lizards for the back-to-back 5K that we did at Castaway Key to raise money for Give Kids the World. There's just certain things that might not have a ton of value to anybody else, but they're priceless to me. So again, if you have anything like that, I would love to hear your story. Now, if you would like to share audio for the show, we can do that as well. You know that on your iPhone, you can go in there and there's a voice memos app. Just talk into it. That's all you got to do. And then you can email it to me at mike@beourguestpodcast.com, and I can work that in here if you want to. This is our show. You guys are patrons. You guys are the heart of this podcast. You're letting me continue to podcast, which I cannot thank you enough for. So if you have one of your stuff with stories kind of things around the house that's unusual, especially for your geography, right? If it's something up in the Northeast that I have no idea people would have in their house, but it's special to you and there's a backstory to it. I love the backstories. I hope you do too, because that's kind of what this whole little mini podcast is about. It's about backstories. It's about getting to know, who somebody is. In this case, it's kind of my backstory with a lot of things, but I love hearing your backstories as well. Feedback from last week's show. Let's jump into that real quick, and then we'll get into today's topic, which is a really nerdy topic, but I think if you stick with me, you're going to see how it has really made me into who I am as far as podcasting. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, Crystal, one of our great patrons over there on patreon.com/BeOurGuestPodcast, she said, because I was talking about taking road trips at one point, she has a great website for U.S. road trips. It's http www.roadsideamerica.com. So we talked about road trips a couple of shows ago. If you want to take a road trip, I'm going to check that one out, roadsideamerica.com, because as I see travel here in 2021, I'm guessing as we see this pandemic hopefully start to ease into summer and fall and, as we start winter 2021, what I'm guessing what would happen, and this isn't earth shaking, this is common sense. I think what we're going to see is domestic travel really have a boon here in 2021, right? A lot of places are not allowing border crossings, flights, and, the requirements to either get into an international location or to get back to the States once you have visited outside of the States. They might be cumbersome for some time now. You might have to get tested. You might have to quarantine. But if you stay within the United States, for example, you guys know I'm here in Missouri. There's so many amazing places I can hop in my car. That's the good part about being in the Midwest. Bad part, you're not by an ocean. You're not by a lot of fun stuff. But being in the dead center of the country, I could hop in a car and be into the Rocky Mountains in like a 10 hours drive. In 14 hours, I can be in Florida. I could probably be up to Canada, the Canadian border within 14 hours if I wanted to. I could be down into Texas. I could actually be down in New Orleans in probably 12 hours. So now California, long drive. Done it once. Don't know if I'll do it again. But the good news is, I think domestic travel will pick up, and there is a lot to see in our country. Great national parks, great kitschy things on the side of the road, big balls of yarn and biggest rocking chairs, the largest golf tee in Illinois, stuff like that. We've got amusement parks, theme parks. We got a lot of stuff to do in the United States. So you know what? Domestic travel isn't a terrible thing. We're very, very blessed in the United States to have what we have. And so I think if we have to go domestically for a year, hey, it's a chance to explore things. For example, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the show or not. I have never been to Silver Dollar City, which is a huge, well, not huge, but it's very, very popular in the Midwest as far as a theme park. And I know that Matt Parrish is a huge fan of Silver Dollar City because he lives near it down in Springfield. It's in Branson, which is down in Southwest Missouri. And I've talked to him about it, and he still can't believe that I've lived in St. Louis for 47 years, never been to Silver Dollar City. It's only about a 3.5 hour drive from here, but I haven't. In what he tells me is that it reminds him very much of old Disneyland because it's family owned. It's very, built into the foliage and the geography of the Ozark Mountains. It's a very green, very homey. So my goal is to get down there sometime this summer just to check that out, because what else, probably not going to take a cruise this summer, probably going to save my money, maybe go in 2022. But, I could take some of that money and have a good weekend down and, just drive down to Southwest Missouri and explore a new place I've never been. And I can already see it. I'll probably fall in love with the place because I've seen the marketing, I've seen the website, and it looks really, really cool. All right. One other comment from last week's show. It is from my good friend Megan Green. Thanks for being a patron. She says, that was fun. I'm really nostalgic. I'm a really nostalgic person, so I like hearing about things that are special to people and why. Thanks for the trip down your memory lane. You're welcome. P.S. We're lucky because my boys are accidentally pro travelers because we've had them on road trips since they were 5 months old because we live away from both of our families. So they regularly take 5 to 6 hour rides to visit the grandparents. So long road trips are nothing to them, and they love to travel. We didn't mean to do that, but we're so glad it worked out that way. Mallory's kind of that way too, because we took our first ride down to Florida when she was 6 months old. Of course, I didn't fly back then. So she has been on many, many road trips to Florida and back, which is 14 hours each way. But the thing is, now that we've started flying, it's going to be hard to get her to switch back. The good news is that she's a competitive cheerleader. So they do have competitions around the Midwest. Just this year, they've been to Indianapolis. They've been to the Dells in Wisconsin. We typically go to Schaumburg, Illinois, up by Chicago, a couple, 2-3 times a year, places like that. So they do have road trips. But I'm telling you, now road trips is just, if you have kids, it's just head down, click, click on the phone. That's all it is. Oh, I miss again, I'm older, but I used to love seeing stuff, that you can't see at home, but I guess that's just the way it is. They'll watch it on YouTube. All right, let's get into today's topic. I'm excited for this one. And again, you got to stick with me on this one and ride this one out, because this is Mike in the Midwest, and you guys know me from the Be Our Guest podcast. And I've shared stuff over the years. Again, we'll be hitting our 13th anniversary with the show here in a couple of months. So over the years, I've talked about when the show started, Mallory was 2 months old. She's now a teenager. So we have, I bring her up on the show when stories, allow and stuff like that. I talk about my wife, Paige, that's at Mizzou, all that kind of stuff. But, who I am right now, if I want to trace it back to where I got an itch for something like podcasting, it really goes back to about early elementary school. Okay, so this might be a series of shows and probably not back to back. I don't want to nerd you out on a lot of this stuff, but I want to tell you how I got to where I am with podcasting. And it really does start back in like 3rd or 4th grade. So let me kind of give you the genesis of all this. This is going to be not everything about this topic, but it's going to be the start. And if you want to do research, there's a lot of great YouTube videos. There's a lot of great articles and so forth. And I want to talk about when I got into what was called BBSing back in the day. Now, you might not have any idea. It's not BSing. I don't BS anybody. It's BBSing. There's 2 B's. And it stands for Bulletin Board Service. So even before that, one of my friends, I remember Jeremy Steffens, when I was in 3rd grade, we were good friends. I remember the thing I remember about kids in elementary school is so weird. He played the alto sax. I played the snare drum because my dad was a drummer. So we were in band together, and we hung out at recess and all that good stuff. I went over to his house in Hazelwood a bunch of times, after school and so forth. But he had a couple of things that I wanted. One, he had a hamster, which I didn't have any pets at the time. And his hamster was in, do you remember those things that were called habit trails? So it was like this modular hamster cage. So it would have a basic kind of cube the hamster would live in, but it had tubes, and like it'd be like a skybox up there, a little wheel that stuck out the side. And you could buy different components at Past Pets. Remember Past Pets at the mall? Have the dogs in the window and stuff, and had a little room in the back where you get a dog and pet it, like play with it in the little room, had reptiles in the back. Those are the days. Those next to the Chick-fil-A where I worked. Anyway, you could buy different components. So you could make this habit trail. Like you could go, your hamster could go like through a tube over to another big section, go in the wheel, or, there's all kinds of like little add-ons. Almost look like a little space station. So he had one of those and a hamster, and I thought that was so cool. Guess what? I got a hamster at some point right after that, thanks to my parents. And also, one other thing that he had that was just unbelievable was a Commodore 64 computer. This thing was unreal. Like the games he had. Now, he had most of his games on cartridge back then. So it was like a Nintendo in that way. You just plug the cartridge into the back of the Commodore 64 and it would play games. You had joysticks and so forth. It was very much like an Atari, or, like an Intellivision or ColecoVision or something like that back in the day. But the sound was amazing. The graphics were amazing. It killed my Atari 2600 that I had. And so, we'd play all those games. I remember we played a game called Summer Games, and it came out around the time of the 84 LA Olympics. And I've always been into sports. So we really watched the Olympics. And to me, it seemed like, I don't know, I guess because there wasn't as much to choose from. But, when the Olympics were on in the 80s, especially 84, because it was hosted in the United States, the Soviets boycotted, like there was just a real patriotism. Like you wanted to watch every event. You wanted to watch synchronized swimming. Even if you didn't like swimming, even if you didn't like to do anything synchronized in your life, you watched it. You cheered for our team. It did not matter. Track and field, all the sports you watched, and you wore USA stuff. I still do that. Not everybody does. I wish it was more like that still today. But here's the thing. There was a game on the Commodore called Summer Games, and it was just, I mean, like it came in. None of the Atari games did this. Like it was by this company called Epix, and it came in as like do 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 do. And again, we were living in the era of Wide World of Sports on Saturday that you would watch, and it would show you like all the sports from around the world with Al Michaels. God, I love that show on Saturdays on ABC. But I mean, it had the intro to the Olympic theme, and then the doves would fly off. This dude would run in, light the torch, and the games would start. Then you could pick in these little mini games. You had diving, you had running, you had a relay running, you had swimming events, you had skeet shooting. I don't even know if that was an event, but it was. You had gymnastics. You had all these events in it where you could pick your country, your flag, and to play your national anthem if you won. This sold me on the Commodore. Like I had to have a Commodore. It was so cool. So my parents did get me a Commodore eventually. Started off with brutal. It was a cassette deck. It was called a data set. So I had a couple of cartridges. Now, Summer Games was not a cartridge. It was a disc later. But you could plug some cartridges in and play them immediately, just like a Nintendo. The game would start. It was loaded. Boom, you played. It was awesome. But you would also buy some games on cassette. Or so you put it in this little cassette player, you would push the play button and it would load your game. Oh my gosh, it took 20, 25 minutes to load a game. Brutal. Especially if you're like fourth or fifth grade. Brutal. Eventually, I did get a 1541 disk drive. If you're a Commodore fan, you know what that means. It's the old floppy, the big brown bin, which was awesome. It made things a lot quicker. Long story short, I loved my Commodore 64 because I loved playing games. It was the ultimate gaming computer. And back in the day, for a long, long time, just so you know, the Commodore 64 was the most wide-selling computer in the history of the world for a long time. For over 20 years, it held that record, which is pretty amazing. So you probably do know somebody that had a Commodore 64, or I'm guessing if you're any kind of a computer person, maybe you had a Commodore 64. Let me know in the comments below, because I love talking with other people who might have had the boring beige box, the bread bin computer. There's a lot to talk with. I love talking Commodore. Anyway, so this is, again, mini podcast, so I'm not going to get the whole story in today. I'll start the story in today's show. So you play your games on your Commodore 64. Ryan was my buddy across the street. He would come over. He didn't have a Commodore. We played games together. I had Jeremy then come to my house. We played games there. Eventually, we both got disk drives. Like I mentioned, it was called the 1541 disk drive. I'm not kidding. It was like a shoebox size, but a little bit bigger. And you could put 5.25-inch floppy disks in to load your games. But here's the difference between an Atari and a Commodore 64 in that aspect, saying like 1985-ish, is that if you had a friend with games on floppy disks and you had games with floppy disks, you could now this was not legal, but again, we were like 11 or 12. We didn't know. Like, we were just dumb kids. But the thing was, and this is what everybody did, is that if your friend had a game that you wanted, or you had a game that your friend wanted, you could easily go down to Service Merchandise or Venture or Kmart or Target, whatever it is, buy a box of blank floppy disks. Mine were always called bonus. They were always, I think you got a bonus disc. I think you got like 11 discs in the box instead of 10. They were cheap. So you would buy some blank discs, and there were programs like Hack 'em. You could copy the game and just give it to your buddy. So what just happened was you would put the disc in, it would load part of it, put it in memory. You'd put a blank disc in, it would write that part of the game to the disc. You'd put the original back in, it would load more of it. Memory, you just keep changing out the disc till it copied the game. And that's how, I'll be honest, like I probably had, and I had a Commodore for years, probably a decade that I used it. I probably had like 10 store-bought games, and I probably had 500 or more. At least, I would say at least 500 games that were copied from somewhere. And down the road, it gets a little easier than physically meeting up and swapping out discs and stuff like that. But that was just how we did things. And so we played this thing, and played all these games. And the thing too about the Commodore was, I think I read somewhere that there were 20,000 games released for the Commodore. 20,000. So if you think about like the Nintendo, the NES, it had hundreds of games. 20,000 games. So of course you're not going to have all of them, and you'd find some, and there were a lot of duds. There were a lot of terrible games, but you wanted to have a lot of games. So, and you had this Commodore. It was more than just a gaming system. It had a keyboard. And I will tell you what, when I first got my Commodore, this is going to show my age here, is that when I first got my Commodore, I think this might have even been before the data set, the cassette player, but I think it was with the cassette player. My dad bought me this. It was a book, and it was probably about 100 pages, kind of paperback, but it was a big size book. And what it was a book of games. Okay, so you're like, well, a book of games, how's that work? What you had to do was you had to type in the code for all these games line by line by line, and they would be pages and pages long. This was a great way to keep your kid busy if you wanted to in 1984, because I got, each game had a little description. I remember the one that I did, and I remember I typed this thing in and if you mess up, like, you got to find the error. There wasn't like an easy way to find it. I mean, like, one or two typos and this game is not running. So it was this little game that, like, you keyed everything in. Basically what it was like a very, very cheap River Raid game. If you've ever played River Raid on the Atari, you basically just had this little character on the screen. You had to use the arrow keys to keep it from hitting little obstacles in a river. So, but I mean, the obstacles were just other characters from the keyboard. I mean, I might have spent 2 hours keying this thing, and the game was all right, but I mean, it had no graphics, obviously. It was just little characters for the keyboard, but I was proud of that, right? I thought I programmed that. No, I just copied it out of a game, out of a magazine or a book, but that's what you did back then. And then if you got it just right, you would save it to the data set. I think it was called River. It wasn't called River Raid. I'll have to find the book. I'll have to look online. I'm sure that book's somewhere. But I mean, that's how old school this was. Think about how far we've come. Okay, so I don't want this to go too long, but I'm going to tease how maybe this BBS thing, because we haven't even talked about BBSing, how this might have even led me to podcasting. So again, I talked at the top of the show, BBSing stood for Bulletin Board Service. So for years, I just played games, and that was it. And the Commodore was great for games. It was a fine gaming system, but one day I went to Venture. Now, Venture was kind of the rival to Target where we lived. It was exactly the same kind of store as Target. It had clothes, it had computer stuff, it had an automotive section, it had everything. It was exactly like Target, but it was like across the street. So we go into Venture. They had a computer section. Of course, they had Commodore 64 games, Atari games. They had all peripherals, printers, all the stuff you would see. They sold all these things at like Toys R Us and stuff like that, Children's Palace. But this is where I remember this specific day. I go in there and I see this thing on the shelf in the Commodore section next to the printers and the software. Of course, there's utilities and disk drives and cassette players and stuff. But I see this thing, and it's a modem. And I remember the type. It's a share data 300 baud modem. And so I was asking my dad, like, okay, what's that about? And he told me, it's a way to connect your computer through a telephone line to other computers to exchange software, to you can read like articles. If people have those on their computers, you can connect to some libraries and stuff like that. I thought, that is so cool. So I didn't get it that night. So what I had to do, I think it was like $35 for this modem. So I remember I went back and I cut some more lawns, because that's exactly how we raised money when I was a kid in the summertime. I cut about 5 or 6 people on my street. I cut their grass. I charged $7 for the front and back and trimming. And I would cut their grass, and I would just save the money and use that for stuff like this. So I remember going back about a month later, and I got that shared at a 300 baud modem. And it just plugged right into the back of the Commodore 64 computer. And then you plugged your phone line into the back of the modem. And it came with a software, and the software was called terminal software, and it would connect you to what it did. It made your computer, your Commodore, dial a phone number to make some kind of a frequency, a noise that the acoustics would connect to the other computer on the other end if it was set to receive and you were calling, and you could make that connection. And so I remember it was magical, because all of a sudden, the thing is that there were no really graphics when I first started doing this, connecting to other computers. You would call these other places, and they were called BBSs, or Bulletin Board Services. And what they were on the other end were people who had set up a computer specifically to answer phone calls so that you could call them. And so, also, just kind of a side note, as I'm thinking about this story, you might wonder, like, where do you get these phone numbers? Because they would just be regular phone numbers. I remember the phone number to my BBS, which we'll talk about in a future show, because I ran a BBS for years and years, a big one. It was called the Farside BBS, and my phone number was 314-921-4269. I still remember it because it was specifically for the BBS. Now, I just remember like how all of a sudden I was connecting to another computer, and what you could do on the other end was pretty magical, because even though there were no graphics, and a lot of these actually BBSs back in those days ran on like TRS 80s or other Commodore 64 computers or very early Apple computers. There's a lot of what I connected to, but they would have message areas where you could post messages. And it was like, if you remember the Be Our Guest podcast forums, the V Bulletin forums we had years ago with all the messages, it's kind of like our Discord right now, but it was no graphics. It was very primitive, and it was everybody for the most part was within your same area code, because again, you still had to dial long distance if you wanted to get outside of, like, if I wanted to get outside of St. Louis, I'd have to pay money, just like I was phoning somebody a long distance phone call. So obviously when I was like 10, 11, I couldn't do that. So I could only call BBSs that were within the 314 area code, but you could leave a message and you could have conversations. So like what you would, but the thing is, when you got on the BBS, nobody else could, the phone line was busy. So what, when you connected, you would get on there and you would post a message, or you would read the messages from earlier in the day and you'd respond to them. And it was really cool because it was so interactive and so real time, that we thought back then. And here's the other thing, is like an 11 or a 12-year-old, these BBSs all had like super cool names, like the Pirate's Lair, or like the Black Hole, or like Pegasus, or Lefty's Hideout. That was my very first BBS, not as popular as the Far Side, but it was Lefty's Hideout. But you had all of these cool, the Outpost or Midnight Runners. These were all like cool places. And again, when you're younger, your imagination runs wild when you're connecting to the Pirates Cove. And what they would have, the whole theme of the BBS would be, themed around the pirate culture. So maybe the sysop. Now, if I mention the word sysop, that stood for system operator, or the person who ran the system on the other end. Their screen name, their username, if it was the Pirates Cove, might be Captain Hook. Because you always use fake names. I used Lefty because I was a left-handed pitcher. But it was, there was Star Trek, or you could call the Enterprise, and like the sysop would be Captain Kirk, stuff like that. And it was, again, you really had to use your imagination because there weren't any graphics early on, but everybody, it was like it's like you were going into a secret club and talking with people you didn't know. But you could talk about, getting software. You could talk about, and it was a lot of nerd kind of stuff, because you had to kind of be, I don't use nerd in a very kind way, but I mean, you had to be a computer type person to actually be doing this, to be on a BBS. So BBSing was an incredible hobby that I did for years and years and years and years. And so as you did this, you started to see like, okay, these are the BBSs that I really like to call, because they have cool people. They have a lot of messages. People call this one a lot. I'm going to call this one a lot, because the last thing you wanted to do was to call a BBS that nobody else called, because you wouldn't have any new messages. And as time went on, they would add very primitive, like, online games. One of them was called Pigskin Picks. I remember this. And so during the NFL season, you would pick, it wasn't anything difficult. You would just pick the winner of each week's football games. And then whoever won the most that week, whoever got the most correct, was like the champion for the week, and it kept score for the whole season. That was one of the boards had that. I love that little feature. There were like little online chess games and checker games and stuff like that. But mostly you went for the messages. But also, on a side note, and I'm going to probably leave it here and then kind of pick this up in the next, part of this whole epic, how we get from BBSing to podcasting. One of the things that a lot of people use BBSing for was software exchange. Now, I told you, like when Jeremy and I would get together and he had software I wanted, or I had software he wanted, we'd buy blank discs at Service Merchandise. We'd meet up, we'd swap out stuff, and it worked very well. You could copy a lot of games that way and transfer files that way. Now, if you want it to be really efficient, the thing that BBS has became known for, other than messaging, which is kind of a shame because of course I like the messaging more. I like just talking with people that I didn't know, and it was fun. But the thing was, they became known as wares sites, WAREZ sites. So what that meant, wares stood for software, but mostly hacked software. And so what would happen is some of these BBSs would have on their computer, because all it was a computer with a phone line that was answering. But what it would have is either a hard drive or a combination of other drives available, so that if you wanted to, you could upload a file to their BBS. And then in exchange, you could also download files from their BBS. So you could send files to this BBS, which would be accessible to everybody on the BBS. And then because it was kind of like a credit system, usually it was like a 1-to-1. If you uploaded a file, you could download a file. You usually had to do, you usually wasn't a free for all. You had to upload before you could download. But if you uploaded something, then you could go through the library on that drive and just pick anything you wanted and download it. Now, again, I mentioned I had a 300 baud modem. This is about as slow as a cursor can scroll across anybody's screen right now. It was dirt slow. So downloading a very small program would take an hour and a half. A bigger game might take days. But there was a way to get past that eventually. Cutting more grass and umpiring helped. But we'll talk about that later. But yes, BBSing as a hobby brought me in. Okay. So because I loved being able to get on my computer, call outside, and talk to people that were not in my circle, right? I mean, they were in St. Louis for the most part because you didn't want to call long distance, but you talk to people with different backgrounds. You talk to people that were on TRS-80s. You talk to people on Commodores, on Apples. You talked about software. You talked about sports. And again, I was like 11 or 12. I'm sure I was talking with other kids my age, but also adults. But you really weren't judged, because like I could type super fast. It was just one of those things that it was the beginning of the world opening up. It was the beginning of really the internet in a way, which we'll talk about again as we go through this whole thing and talk about BBSing. But if you think about it, kind of to tie this into a bow here for just this part of the story, for me, podcasting started with my wife getting me an iPod for Christmas one year. And I didn't know what to do with this thing. I was super appreciative of the gift, and I love Apple products, but I'm just not a person who listens to a lot of music. I used to DJ at the skating rink. I DJ'd wedding receptions. I've been around music my whole life, and I love 80s music, but I'm not one that will seek out to listen to music like as a lot of people do, but I don't. And so I wanted to use this little piece of technology, which I thought was amazing, for something. And so I eventually went on the, iTunes was what it was called back then. Went on iTunes, searched Disney for some Disney music, and clicked on this thing called podcasts and found, basically like AM radio talk about Walt Disney World. It was called Inside the Magic with Ricky Briganti. And this came out every week and it was free. And all I had to do was plug my iPod into my computer. It would sync it up to the iPod and I could listen to the shows, usually about an hour and a half each week. And I was hooked. Totally free content, updated once a week about something I was super interested in. I was hooked. Now, I was hooked as a consumer. I was hooked as a podcast listener. But as always happens with me, and I think happens with a lot of you out there on the other end, like as you get into a hobby or you start to develop some kind of a passion for something, you want to do more. Like you want to become a part of the community. And I think everybody on the inside has a voice, and you want to get that voice out there. And eventually that's what I wanted to do. I want to be more of, instead of a consumer, more of a producer within the community. So that's kind of how that happened. And also getting back to BBSing, I was very much a consumer for years. But then I thought, wow, I have some kind of spin on this. I think I could do this. And I became more of a producer, and I ran a BBS at some point. So we'll talk about that as we get going through this little series. I don't know if you're going to enjoy this or not, but there is a serious connection to 11-year-old Mike calling BBSs to having the Be Our Guest podcast right now. There's so many parallels. So give me some feedback over at patreon.com/Be Our Guest podcast. What do you think about the first part? If you don't want to hear any other parts, I totally get it. We'll go back to other topics. I just want to throw that out here because I'm super passionate about this. And I think it really is a sign of the times. Now, if you're younger, you're probably thinking this is totally dumb. But if you're somebody that might be in your 40s, you might relate to this. And I'm going to get into like college and Netscape and go into the university computer lab to connect to the internet, stuff like that as we get through this, how we connect the dots to get from, this brown beige, they called it the bread bin, Commodore 64 in my bedroom, to podcasting to the world. It's pretty amazing. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Hope we got to pass about 30 minutes here, doing some kind of maybe you're doing a menial job that you're not enjoying today, or you're on a treadmill, just trying to get the steps in. I get that. But wherever you are, I hope you're staying safe and healthy. And I sure appreciate you being a patron. If you ever need anything, let me know. I appreciate you guys being here. Don't forget to also join us on Discord, on the Discord channel, just for our patrons. We have so much fun. And right now I'm using you guys. I'm soliciting, is this romantic situations? I need those for in a couple weeks. We're going to do the show and the patrons are going to have the first dibs on all the scenarios for that podcast this year. So you guys are awesome. So anyway, hang in there and have a great week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you real soon. An SE. Yeah. Oh my gosh. You know what? I have my old Commodore, and my dad found a Commodore. Jennifer, my dad found a Commodore in the transmitter for 101 ESPN. He went down to the transmitter where the antenna was, and in that building under the big antenna that goes up 1,000 feet, there was a Commodore 64 in the box sitting in that room, and he got it for me. So I'm super pumped about that. I haven't hooked it up yet. I need a disk drive and I need a monitor, but I am going to, and I need the little box in the back that was a TV computer box. I need that, but yeah, I'm pumped. Who'd have thought you found a, hang on, I'm saving this. Episode 32. Yeah, but who'd think you'd find a Commodore 64 at a radio station? He found it last year in 2020. He's like, you want this? I'm like, yeah, I want this. And it's a Commodore 64C. It's not the bread bin. It's the white one that looks so cool. Anyway, I got to edit this thing up and put it up. So you guys have a good day. And I'm not going out on the roads until I go to Taco Bell tonight. All right. See you guys later. Bye-bye.